Today in Ankara, Turkey, Donald Trump sat down with Recep Tayyip Erdogan and announced that the United States would lift economic sanctions that had been in place for years. Sanctions imposed because Turkey had bought Russian military equipment. In exchange, Turkey gets F-35 consideration. Trump gets a friendly host for a summit where he is demanding every NATO member spend 5% of their GDP on defense. Meanwhile, Trump told reporters he was very disappointed with NATO, that European allies hadn't supported him enough on Iran, that the United States spends more than everyone else and gets too little in return. Every major network is covering this as a diplomatic story, a Trump story and NATO crisis story. History sees it differently. History sees a pattern that has appeared at the end of every great imperial cycle in the modern era. A dominant power, its finances strained, its military commitments exceeding its fiscal capacity, begins asking its allies to carry more of the load. The language changes from summit to summit. The underlying dynamic does not, and in every previous instance where this dynamic appeared, where the hegemon began treating its alliances as cost burdens rather than strategic investments, the process that followed was not a negotiation, it was a retrenchment. To understand what is breaking in Ankara today, you need to understand what was built in Washington in 1949 and why. NATO was not created as an equal partnership. It was created as an explicitly asymmetric arrangement in which the United States provided the overwhelming majority of military capability, nuclear deterrence, and strategic depth, while European members contributed primarily conventional forces, geographic territory, and political legitimacy. This asymmetry was not an accident or an oversight, it was a deliberate design choice rooted in the specific circumstances of 1949, circumstances that made American dominance both necessary and, from Washington's perspective, strategically beneficial. Europe in 1949 was economically devastated. The Marshall Plan had begun the process of reconstruction, but Western European economies remained fragile. Their militaries, hollowed out by 6 years of war, their populations traumatized and unwilling to contemplate rapid rearmament. The Soviet threat was real and immediate. Stalin's Berlin blockade had ended just months before NATO's founding, and the United States was the only Western power with the military capacity and economic strength to provide credible deterrence against Soviet expansion. But there was a second dimension to American willingness to carry the alliance's primary burden that is less often acknowledged. NATO was not just a security arrangement, it was an economic arrangement. American military dominance in Europe meant American political influence over European economic policy. It meant European markets integrated into the dollar-based trading system that sustained American financial primacy. It meant bases, contracts, procurement relationships, and the geopolitical infrastructure that made the American century possible. The asymmetry was, in other words, a bargain, not just a burden. America paid more than its proportional share of the alliance's military costs. In return, America received something that was worth far more than those costs: the institutional architecture of a world order organized around American economic and financial primacy. This is the bargain that Trump's rhetoric implicitly rejects or fails to understand. His framing of NATO as a one-sided financial arrangement in which America pays and Europe benefits misses the second half of the ledger: the exorbitant privilege, the dollar dominance, the global financial infrastructure that the American security umbrella helped create and sustain. The historical pattern of imperial burden shifting that Trump's NATO demands represent has its clearest ancient precedent in Rome's late imperial period, specifically in the evolution of Rome's federative system from strategic asset to structural vulnerability. Rome at its height maintained its empire through a combination of direct legionary power and an extensive network of allied relationships, foederati, client kingdoms, and tributary states that contributed troops, resources, and strategic buffer zones to the empire's defense in exchange for Roman protection, trade access, and the legitimacy that Roman recognition conferred. In the early and middle imperial period, this system worked because the underlying bargain was credible. Rome could genuinely protect its allies. The legions were effective, the borders were secure, and the economic benefits of integration into the Roman trading network were real. Allies paid their tribute and contributed their troops because the Roman security guarantee was worth more than the cost. As the third century crisis deepened, as the fiscal strain of endless frontier wars exhausted the treasury, as the currency was debased to fund military expenditure, as political instability at the center undermined the reliability of Roman policy, the terms of the federate bargain began to shift. Rome could no longer consistently deliver on its security guarantees. Allies found themselves defending their own territories without reliable Roman support. The legions that had once been the backbone of imperial defense became increasingly composed of federate troops, whose loyalty was to their commanders rather than to Rome. The burden shifting that characterized late Roman imperial policy was not a deliberate strategic choice. It was a fiscal necessity. The empire could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its own defense, and the attempt to offload that cost onto allies degraded the very thing, Roman military reliability, that had made the alliance worth having. Allies who were asked to pay more for less protection eventually concluded that the arrangement was no longer worth maintaining. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the various Germanic federates who eventually sacked Rome were not foreign invaders in the simple sense. Many of them had been Roman allies, peoples who had been integrated into the Roman federate system and who, when Rome's side of the bargain deteriorated beyond a certain threshold, concluded that the costs of loyalty exceeded its benefits. The lesson for the present: Britain's attempt to shift the burden of imperial defense onto its dominions and colonies in the early 20th century offers a more directly relevant and better documented historical parallel than Rome, and its outcome provides a precise template for what the historical record suggests follows from the current American approach. The British Empire, at its late 19th century peak, was the most extensive territorial empire in human history. But the cost of defending that empire, maintaining the Royal Navy's global reach, garrisoning territories from India to South Africa to Canada, projecting military power across every ocean simultaneously, was becoming an increasingly significant fiscal burden even as British industrial output began declining relative to Germany and the United States. The response developed through the 1890s and early 1900s was a systematic attempt to persuade the self-governing dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, to contribute more directly to the empire's defense. The imperial conferences of Village 1979 and 1979 were, in effect, the Victorian and Edwardian equivalent of Trump's NATO summits, occasions on which the dominant power attempted to extract more defense spending commitments from its nominal partners. The results were instructive. The dominions proved willing to contribute on their own terms for their own strategic interests and under conditions that gave them increasing autonomy over how their contributions were deployed. Australia and New Zealand supported Britain in the Boer War and both World Wars. Canada provided enormous resources in both World Wars. But each contribution came with an implicit renegotiation of the imperial relationship. Each time the dominions paid more, they demanded more say in the decisions that their payments were funding. This was the dynamic that ultimately transformed the British Empire into the British Commonwealth, a voluntary association of sovereign states rather than an imperial hierarchy. The burden shifting that Britain attempted for fiscal reasons inadvertently accelerated the political transformation of imperial relationships into something more like a genuine alliance of equals, in which Britain's special status as the dominant partner was progressively eroded. The parallel to the current NATO situation is direct. Trump's demands for more European defense spending, delivered in the transactional language of cost accounting rather than strategic partnership, are producing exactly the response that Britain's dominion burden shifting produced. European allies are indeed spending more on defense, but they are doing so in ways that build European strategic autonomy rather than simply subsidizing American leadership. France's push for European strategic independence, Germany's dramatic rearmament, the emerging European defense industrial cooperation, these are the 21st century equivalents of the Dominion contributions that gradually transformed imperial dependency into sovereign partnership. The bill is being paid, but the payment is purchasing independence, not loyalty. Within the broader pattern of burden shifting and alliance restructuring, Turkey's specific position at the Ankara summit deserves attention because Turkey's trajectory illustrates in miniature the strategic dynamics playing out across the entire alliance. Turkey has spent the past decade positioning itself as an indispensable swing state in the emerging multipolar order, maintaining its NATO membership and its relationships with Western powers while simultaneously deepening economic and military ties with Russia, pursuing strategic relationships with Gulf states, and acting as an independent mediator in conflicts where Western powers have limited leverage. Turkey brokered the Black Sea grain deal between Ukraine and Russia in 2020. Turkey has maintained trade relationships with Russia despite Western sanctions pressure. Turkey purchased the Russian S-400 missile system despite American objections, triggering the F-35 exclusion that Trump is now considering reversing. Erdogan's strategy has been, in essence, to make Turkey simultaneously too valuable to NATO to expel and too independent to discipline. The result is exactly what Ankara now produces. Trump lifting sanctions, offering F-35 consideration, and describing Erdogan as a very strong leader, while other NATO allies watch from the sidelines of a summit where the American president has no bilateral meetings with them scheduled. The historical parallel is the small states that positioned themselves advantageously during previous imperial transitions, the neutral states that maintained relationships with both declining and rising powers, extracting concessions from each. Switzerland during the Napoleonic Wars, Sweden during the Cold War. In each case, the states that benefited most from imperial transition periods were those that preserved strategic flexibility rather than committing fully to either the declining or rising order. Turkey's model: maximum strategic flexibility, minimum ideological commitment, transactional relationships with all major powers, is increasingly being studied and imitated by other medium powers navigating the current transition. Saudi Arabia's simultaneous BRICS membership and U.S. security relationship, India's strategic autonomy doctrine, Indonesia's careful neutrality, the multiplication of the Turkish model across the global south is itself a structural indicator of where the current world order stands in its transition. The deepest reason that Trump's NATO demands are historically significant, more significant than any individual summit's outcomes, is the fiscal mechanism that is driving them, independent of any particular president's preferences or negotiating style. The United States federal government currently spends approximately $800 billion annually on defense, roughly 40% of all global military spending. This expenditure is financed at the margin by deficit spending that adds to a national debt already exceeding $36 trillion. The annual interest cost on that debt has crossed $1 trillion, more than the entire defense budget just 15 years ago. In this fiscal environment, every major spending category is under structural pressure. Defense is the largest discretionary item in the federal budget and therefore one of the primary targets when fiscal constraint eventually becomes unavoidable. The political and strategic logic for maintaining current American military commitments in Europe, the Pacific, and the Middle East simultaneously while fighting an active conflict in the Persian Gulf, maintaining nuclear deterrence and funding the domestic programs that American voters actually prioritize requires a fiscal capacity that the current debt trajectory is progressively constraining. This is the mechanism that historians recognize as imperial overstretch, a concept developed by Paul Kennedy in his 1910 work on the rise and fall of great powers, in which he identified the consistent pattern of great powers whose military commitments eventually exceeded the economic base capable of sustaining them. Kennedy's analysis, applied to the United States, argued that the gap between American global military commitments and American economic and fiscal capacity was the primary long-term threat to American primacy, more consequential than any external military competitor. Kennedy wrote that in 1970, the American national debt at that time was approximately $2.5 trillion. It is now $36 trillion. The gap between commitments and capacity that Kennedy identified as a long-term risk has, in the intervening 4 decades, grown by a factor of roughly 15. Trump's NATO demands are, from this perspective, not primarily a product of Trump's specific views about alliances or burden sharing. They are the political expression of a fiscal reality that any American president governing at this point in the debt cycle would eventually be forced to confront. The language and style are Trump's. The underlying fiscal imperative is structural. The NATO burden shifting story connects directly to the monetary themes this series has been building because American military primacy and dollar reserve currency status are not independent phenomena. They are two expressions of the same underlying power and they rise and fall together. The dollar's reserve currency status, as examined across this series, rests on several structural pillars: the depth and liquidity of dollar-denominated financial markets, the petrodollar arrangement, the weaponization of the dollar system as documented in the sanctions video, and less often discussed but equally fundamental, the American military guarantees that underpins the entire global trading order. The dollar is trusted as the world's reserve currency, in part because American military power guarantees the security of the global commons, the shipping lanes, the air corridors, the communication infrastructure through Trump's warm relationship with Erdogan, the bilateral meeting, the sanction lifts, the F-35 consideration is not simply a personal preference or an ideological affinity between two strongmen. It reflects a structural reality about Turkey's position in the emerging multipolar order that any American strategist would need to reckon with. Turkey sits at the intersection of three of the most strategically significant geographies in the current world order: Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. It controls the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, through which Russian naval vessels must pass to access the Mediterranean. It borders Iran, Iraq, and Syria. It shares maritime boundaries with Greece across the Aegean. It is simultaneously a NATO member and a country with deep historical and cultural ties to the Turkic world of Central Asia that Russia and China are also contesting. In a unipolar world anchored by American dominance, Turkey's geographic position was an asset to be managed within the constraints of Atlantic Alliance membership. In a multipolar world where the United States, Russia, China, and regional powers are all contesting influence, Turkey's position becomes a strategic resource of the first order, a country that every major power needs to either have on its side or neutralize. Erdogan has understood this with exceptional clarity and has played his position accordingly. The result is the summit in Ankara, where Turkey is simultaneously the host of the NATO meeting, the recipient of American sanctions relief, a country that has maintained deep economic ties with Russia throughout the Iran war, a BRICS observer, and the only NATO member that Russia has not explicitly threatened. Turkey has extracted maximum value from the transition precisely because it has refused to commit fully to either the declining or rising order. Drawing on the Roman, British, and Cold War precedents, the historical record produces a specific and sobering prediction about the trajectory of American alliance politics that Trump's Ankara summit represents. The first stage, where the alliance remains formally intact while the dominant power begins demanding more contributions from its partners, is where the current situation sits. The NATO alliance exists, its members are under pressure increasing their defense spending. The formal architecture of Western security is intact. The second stage, in which burden shifting creates asymmetries of interest that begin to fracture the alliance's strategic coherence, is visible in embryonic form. European allies building strategic autonomy rather than simply contributing to American-led missions. Turkey extracting bilateral concessions in exchange for cooperation. Gulf states maintaining relationships with multiple competing powers simultaneously. The third stage, in which the alliance's practical effectiveness is significantly reduced even as its formal existence is maintained, is where Rome and Britain both spend significant time before the formal dissolution that historians record as the endpoint. The alliance exists on paper. Its members meet, sign agreements, announce spending commitments. But the underlying strategic coordination that makes an alliance militarily meaningful has been replaced by a transactional negotiation that produces the appearance of cooperation without the substance. The fourth stage, formal dissolution or transformation into something structurally different, is where Rome's federated system ended and where the British Empire's transformation into the Commonwealth completed. The formal institutions survive, but their strategic character has changed so fundamentally that continuity is largely nominal. The historical timeline from the first stage to the fourth incomparable imperial transitions has ranged from decades to generations. It is not a linear process, it involves reversals, apparent stabilizations, and sudden accelerations of the kind documented throughout this series. What the historical record does not provide is a case in which an imperial power successfully arrested this progression once the fiscal mechanism driving it, the gap between commitments and the economic capacity to sustain them, was in an advanced stage. The arrests that occurred, America's own Cold War consolidation, Britain's temporary stabilization in the 1950s. In Ankara today, Trump lifted sanctions on Turkey, demanded 5% GDP defense spending from the alliance, and expressed disappointment with his European allies. Markets noted it, diplomats managed it, historians recognized it because they've seen this before, not with these specific leaders, not in this specific form, not with these specific leaders, not in this specific form, not with these specific leaders, not in this specific form, not with these precise geopolitical details, but with the same underlying logic, a dominant power whose fiscal position is forcing it to recalibrate the terms of alliances that were built in a different era under different conditions, with a different balance between cost and return. The bill is due. History knows who pays it in the end, and it's never just money. This series has now traced 12 mechanisms of the current transition: bond markets, gold, petrodollar, middle-class wealth, sanctions, internal order, the reserve currency timeline, asset class survival, ceasefire fragility, the new Fed chair, Chinese treasury sales, and now alliance burden shifting. Every mechanism points in the same direction, every data point adds another layer to the same underlying historical pattern. The next video will do something this series hasn't yet attempted: synthesize all 12 mechanisms into a single integrated framework, mapping exactly where each indicator places the current moment on the historical transition timeline, and what the aggregate picture implies about the decade ahead. Subscribe, because the synthesis is where everything this series has built comes together.